My buddy Rob said, "Hey, I'd like to buy a Losi LMT from you. And oh, by the way, can you race prep it for me?" No problem. Got you covered. This is what I did to make it happen. So my buddy Rob decided he wanted to get back into RC and start racing again, and he decided that solid axle monster trucks was going to be the way to go this time. So he asked me to take a stock roller Losi LMT and do all my tips and tricks to it to make it into a really good pro mod racer for him so he could run it with a bunch of guys in Connecticut at RC Madness. So I went ahead and did a bunch of stuff to the truck, all little things, easy things that you can do yourself to make the truck perform really well. Out of the box, the truck is actually very good, and you can race it as is. Believe it or not, there's a lot of adjustment there, a lot of little things that you can tweak on it to get the truck dialed in, but I took Rob's truck and I went a step further. So on this truck, I went with a trail truck body. I've been finding that a lot of the trail truck bodies out there fit really well on solid axle monster trucks. And this is a Pro-Line Chevy Colorado. And this is a body I was actually going to use on a different truck, an LMT with a roll cage. I got it all trimmed out in the back and ready to fit the roll cage, and once I got it on top of it, I realized I didn't like it because the side of the roll cage actually kind of stuck out below the body. Wasn't really happy with the look, so in the end it was going to be scrapped for me. Rob is kind of new to racing solid axle monster trucks and the whole scene, and he's going to crash a lot. So I said, you know what, who cares if the back end's cut out? It's going to be good enough for Rob's truck, so let's go ahead and mount that up. And then I gave it a quick paint job, threw my logo on there, a little advertising doesn't hurt anybody, and he's ready to go. Now he could beat and bang up the truck, he could learn how to drive it, he can just trash this body and not worry about it, and I'll paint him a new one later. On this truck, I mounted up a set of JConcepts Renegade tires, and I mounted them on their Tribute wheels. On the wheels, I'm using the 25mm hex adapters. Now, on this truck, I went with the aluminum hex adapters because there's a lot of torque and power here, and the truck does have some heft to it. And with the plastic adapters, I find that the wheel hex will want to start digging into that hex adapter when you use the plastic one and wants to twist. That's not good, so I went with aluminum hex adapters in this truck. Now, there's a couple problems with using the hex adapters that I've been finding. One, the hole in the center is not large enough to get the nut driver in because this has a larger wheel nut than standard trucks. And there's not a lot of thread engagement, so I modified the hex adapters. Threw them in my lathe, opened up the hole in the center a little bit, so now I can use the stock nut, and I can use a MIP 8mm nut driver. And then I have to, of course, because the axle itself is a little bit larger, I drilled the center of it out to allow that axle to go in and out freely without jamming up. And the other thing I did too was I took the hole in the center and I made it a little bit deeper so that I had more thread engagement. So now the thread of the axle actually makes its way through the nylon on the nut and everything stays in place. Now this is a servo mount that I came up with for my trucks. I use them on all my trucks. I really like how they work, so I made one for Rob's truck. This is a servo mount that has a carbon fiber base with some standoffs to raise it up off the axle, and it gets the servo a little bit lower than stock because it's no longer sitting at an angle, but also because it has carbon fiber as a base and then an aluminum, basically a TLR aluminum servo mount that acts like a little cage around it, it adds a lot of stiffness. So that servo is not going to move at all, and technically it lowers the center of gravity of the truck. Now I also ditched the stock servo saver. When it comes to racing, generally you don't need a servo saver, especially if you're not hitting everything along the way, so you should be good there. Even for backyard bashing, if you have some simple stuff you're doing like on a baseball field or you're running in your backyard with the grass and you're not doing anything nutty, you really don't need the servo saver. So I went with an aluminum arm to give more positive engagement to the steering. Now the thing about this whole setup is you'll notice that I do have the stock steering link on there, and that steering link, I'm leaving that on there for a reason. That technically is now a servo saver. It does have a little bit of give to it, but it's not so bad that it affects the steering. So that little bit of give should be enough in this situation to act like a servo saver and keep things working just fine. So the end plates on the stock truck are quite long, and that can limit the amount of bodies that you can use on the truck because it's so long that it'll actually stick outside the body, and you'll have to modify the body and have the chassis stick out. Then it doesn't look good, or you'll have to have the body sit a little high, and that's not good for anything, raising that center of gravity. So what I do is I cut the end plates back a little bit to one, make it so I could run more bodies on there. Two, it ends up making it a little bit lighter, and it technically lowers the center of gravity a little bit. Now I went ahead and cheated. I threw these on my milling machine and I took them down that way, so I have a nice clean edge. But you could do the same thing with a hacksaw or a rotary tool with a cutoff wheel. It'll work just fine. And then the spacers in between the body mounts, I put some aluminum spacers in there rather than the plastic ones because they're a little bit stiffer and will reduce flex in the chassis. Now, some of these are ones that I just made myself in my lathe, and other ones that are 60 millimeter spacers that you can find on Amazon. I altered the sway bar a little bit by adding spring steel pieces to the end of the bar instead of the stock pieces. The stock end pieces are made out of what seems to be like just basic steel. Some people are bending and breaking those depending on what you're doing with the truck. If you do bend or break those pieces, don't worry about it. Don't go replace the sway bar. This stock sway bar is actually very good. That is the one downside of the bar, is that it's used in basic steel. For general use, it's fine. But if you want more tunability, you can change material, you could change the diameter, you could change the length, you could do all kinds of things to change the feel of the sway bar on the stock truck. So what I did was I replaced the stock end pieces with some music wire. It's spring steel, and I took and made the flat go all the way down the bar so that I have an infinite amount of adjustment to that bar, so I can fine tune the feel just by moving the bar in or out of the main bar in the center. The stock shocks on the truck are actually very good. They're based on TLR 22 shocks, and they have a lot of technology built into them that makes those cars work really well, so it's going to make this truck work really well. But there are some things that you need to look at and that you need to do to get the truck to perform its best, especially when it comes to racing. Now, these modifications will also work well for a basher type truck, so you might want to look into this stuff for your basher if you're not racing. So basically, first of all, the rod ends. You'll have a lot of people online that complain they go off a 1 foot jump and the rod end pulls out and they didn't do anything. Well, they got, because the factory, whoever's building them at the factory basically stripped out the rod end, right? So on this truck, for example, I had 3 out of the 4 rod ends were stripped from the factory. So all I did was get new ones and replace them and made sure they weren't stripped. So now those are stronger and ready to go. The other thing I do with these shocks is I take the shock cap and I put a little bleeder hole in the top because there is no bleeder hole. I put a little bleeder hole in there to make it a little bit easier to fill them with oil, assemble them, and so on. The other thing I did here, there is no more roll cage, and I'm running a 2S LiPo in the back, so the truck's going to be chassis is going to be a lot lighter, and it's going to not need as much support. So I put front springs all the way around to even out the suspension on both sides, because again, we don't have as much weight in the back, so we don't need that stiffer spring. The other thing that you want to do with these shocks is just open them up and check the E-clips that hold the piston in place. The E-clips are very small, and that's fine, but the problem is when they assemble them out at the factory, sometimes when you put that little E-clip in, it looks like it's actually clipped into place when it's not. So open up the shocks, take a look at those E-clips on the above and below the shock piston, and just push on them to make sure that they are fully seated in the shock shaft, and then you should be absolutely fine. The other thing I do that makes a huge difference in the performance of these shocks is I change the O-rings out. The stock O-rings, for some reason, are oversized. They put a lot of stiction on the shock shafts, and they don't allow those shock shafts to move very smooth. So what I do is I ditch the stock O-rings and I replace them with TLR O-rings. And the performance is night and day. You could even go one step further and add a little O-ring grease to smooth it out even more. I wanted the truck to sit a little bit lower for racing, so I designed some new shock towers. They are available on my Hetmanski Hobbies Shapeways store. These shock towers lower the truck about 0.3 inches, and it also gives a little bit more adjustment when it comes to the side-to-side motion of the shocks. Really easy to install. They're basically a stock replacement, and on top I use a 60 millimeter spacer to add strength to the assembly. Yes, that's right, I am running a stock axle housing on here with no axle braces. Now, a lot of people, when you ask, what's the first upgrade I should do? Everybody says axle housing, axle housings. That's not really the case. If you're racing, you don't have to add aluminum axle housings. You don't really want aluminum axle housings because they add a lot of unnecessary weight and so on. The other thing that people do, though, is they add axle braces, which basically ties in the 2 lower link mounts. And that helps increase strength because those mounts are really only held in place with 2 screws, and they're kind of shallow and they have a tendency to pull out. Well, if you think about how those braces work, you can actually eliminate them by just doing one simple trick. The only downside of this trick is once you do what I'm telling you to do, you're basically stuck with a housing that's one piece. And if you do end up hitting something with the axle housing and breaking it, you do have to replace the entire axle housing, all the parts and pieces that go with it. So what I do is I take the lower link mounts, I take the outside inner pieces and the shock mounts, and I glue them to the axle housing with CA glue. It adds a lot of strength to the housing. You wouldn't believe the amount of flex that it eliminates in the axle housing. And CA glue is actually very strong. I clean all the surfaces, apply just enough glue, not a ton, and I put them all back together. The other thing you do, since those pieces are not going to come out again, and you don't have to worry about them coming out again, you can take the screws, put CA glue on the screws, and drive them in with CA, and that'll increase the strength of the parts even more. The other thing I do to the axle housing is the pins are a problem as well for some people. The stock screws are very small, and again, I think they're stripped at the factory as well, and the pins tend to fall out. So what I do is I remove the stock screws to hold the pins in place. I drill it out with a 1/8 inch drill bit, and I tap it with a 4mm tap and throw a 4mm set screw in there to keep the pins in place so I don't have to worry about them falling out at all. Now another thing I did to the axles on this truck, and I did it to my race truck too, I took the rear differential and I pulled the diff out and I put 50,000 weight in there instead of 100,000 weight in there to allow the truck to pivot in the turns a little bit easier. And I also go in and I adjust the gear mesh a little bit. So from the factory, the gear mesh is a little bit tight, which is fine if you're bashing and running around the yard, but I want it to be a little bit more free for a race truck. So I move the shims around a little bit on the axle from one side to the other to loosen up the gear mesh a little to allow the drivetrain to spin a little more free. One thing I found while experimenting with the truck, that is if you take the center diff, you turn it 180 degrees and change the rotation of the motor from reverse to normal, that the truck will track perfectly straight on a loose surface when you mash the throttle. Out of the box, it has a tendency to pull a little bit to the left, and that can affect, your race if you're racing. But around the backyard, you're not going to really notice it as much. You might not even care. But on the track, if that truck's pulling to the left, that's going to be a bit of a problem. By doing that simple modification, it changes how everything, the motor, the gears, the drive shafts, how everything acts on the chassis, and it actually gets the truck to go straight because there's no torque twist of pulling up that front axle, allowing it to diff out, and then pulling it to the left. It will go straight. If you don't believe me, give it a try. The other thing I do to smooth out the drivetrain is I remove all the grease. Now, before you start typoing in the comment section telling me I'm nuts and that you need grease and all that stuff, think about this. How many cars have a pinion gear and a spur gear? Pretty much all of them. Have you ever seen grease on a pinion and spur gear? Nope. Never. And how many times have you worn those out? Never, right? I never wear them out. So if you think about it, do you really need grease in your drivetrain? I don't think so. So anyways, with these trucks especially, they're only running for a few seconds on a track. It's not going to kill that ring and pinion. It's not going to kill the drivetrain. It's absolutely fine. I eliminate the grease to reduce stiction in the drivetrain and allow it to run more free. Another thing I do is I add weight to the rear axle on my race trucks. Now, that's because the front axle, if you actually took the front and rear axle off and weighed both of them, you'll find that the front axle is considerably heavier because of the servo mount, the steering hubs, the drag link, all the different components used to make it steer add a lot of weight. And that throws off the pressure being applied to the front and rear tires, and it can throw the balance of the truck off. Now, you can't really do it in the chassis. Your chassis can be perfectly balanced, but that doesn't mean your tires are getting equal pressure, right? Because the shocks only apply so much pressure to the axle, and that's it. So I add a little bit of weight to the rear axle to help balance out the feel a little bit. Now, I don't add enough to make it equal to the front axle because I didn't like how that felt on my race truck. It didn't work well for me, so I just want a little bit of weight. The nice thing about this setup, these are TLR weights, and they are threaded in the center. They come two in a package, a heavy weight and let's just call it a medium weight. I drill out the center hole so that it's not threaded anymore, and I use a screw to attach it to the servo mounts on the rear axle. Now you have some adjustability in the weight. So you can leave it as you see it here, or you can add the small weight on top to add more weight, or you can remove the medium weights or the big weights and put the small weights on, So there's a lot of adjustment available depending on the surface and what you're doing and what kind of feel you want on the truck. It's an easy modification to make. This truck is going to be run in the dirt, which is a loose surface, so I left the stock toe blocks in place for the rear axle, and that will add stability in a straight line. Now, some people will argue and say that it doesn't work on a solid axle monster truck, blah, blah, blah. Trust me, it absolutely does make a difference. It adds straight line stability. It does work. If you don't believe me, try it. You'll see the difference that it makes. So on a loose surface, I would run the rear toe blocks. On a tight, high grip surface, I would run the 0-degree toe blocks. On this truck, because it's going to be in the dirt, we have rear toe. For the power system in the truck, I'm using a Tekin RX8 speed control, and I paired it with a Tekin Pro HD 550 size 4300 kV motor. Now, I have this power system in some of the other trucks that I have, and I really like how it feels. It puts down plenty of power, really gets that truck going. The nice thing about Tekin stuff, though, the real reason why I really choose Tekin over other speed controls is because it has solder posts that allow you to put whatever wires you want on there, whatever length you want. If you burn up a wire or need to change a wire, it's easy to do. And the most important thing is changing the features and the settings of the speed control is super easy. You press one button to get to the feature you want to change, push the other button to change it, and you're good to go. Very, very simple. And of course, you do have a Bluetooth option and a computer option where you can fine-tune things there, but also you can unlock some things that you don't have by just programming it by hand. The other thing that you see is that the speed control is mounted to my Hetmanski Hobbies low center gravity speed control mount. It puts the speed control between the frame rails and a little bit lower instead of sitting on top of the frame rails. And behind the motor is my Losi battery tray, which helps lower the battery a little bit by getting it basically on top of the frame rails, and it moves some of the battery's weight closer to the center line, which allows the truck to pivot in the turns a lot easier. So that's a quick look at the truck I built for my buddy, and this thing is ready to go and hit the track. And like I said, a lot of the things that I did to this truck are very basic and easy for you to do. Now, even if you're not a racer, some of the changes that I made to this truck will help you as far as backyard bashing. It will make the truck a little more nimble, make it easier to drive, maybe even a little more fun. So even if you're not racing, go ahead and give these things that I did to this truck a try to yours to see how it feels. Now, all the things that I mentioned in this video, the tires, speed control, and so on, I will list them below so you'll be able to find them yourself and use them on your truck.